And today's daf is daf Pei Daled 84 in Masechet Yevamot, and we yesterday got all the way up to the Mishnah. The last thing we said was that Rabbi Eliezer, what Rav said when he went to learn by Rabbi Eliezer ben Shamua, he was beat up by everybody. But anyways, this is the Mishnah he learned, and now we're up to a new parak. So the parak is called Yesh Mutarot. In many ways, this is going to be very easy for all of us as long as we keep things straight. So much easier than what we just finished. And basically, we're about to restate many of the relationships that we've discussed throughout the whole Masechet. So says the Mishnah. Remember, the fundamental principle here is that a man marries a woman, the man dies, the woman falls to if they don't have children, if he doesn't have children, the woman falls to Yibam or Chalitza to his brothers from his father, right? So there are many circumstances in which one relationship between the husband and the woman is in one status, either permitted or prohibited, and the relationship of the brother, the Yavim, as we call him, to the woman would be different status, right? And therefore one would be permitted or not permitted. There are many, many iterations of this. It says our Mishnah, let's go through all these iterations. Yesh mutarot lebalehem. There's some, the truth is it's women, right? So the women, but the real question is the relationship. There's some relationships which are mutar between a woman and her husband, but asurot liyab mehem. But she couldn't marry or stay related to her yavam. We'll see why. Or the opposite, mutarat liyab mehem. She'd be mutter to her yavama, but asurot lebalehem, but prohibited to her spouse. Or mutarot le'elo ve'elo, like normal cases, she'd mutar to both. Or asurot le'elo, or prohibited to both. And what are the examples? What are we referring to? Says the Mishnah, elu mutarot lebalehem, the following people are mutar to their husbands, but asurot le'yab mehem. For example, a kohen hedyot. Let's say you have a regular kohen, as opposed to kohen gadol. Shenasat halmana. He marries a woman who's widowed previously, and so that's totally permitted. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But yeshlo ach kohen gadol, right? His brother happens to be the kohen gadol. He's in the right family. The problem is, of course, that when he dies and his wife falls to his brother for yibam, that's a prohibited relationship because she's an almanah. Of course, the Gemara is going to point out that it's a really silly thing to say that the kohen married an almanah, because every kohen who dies whose brother falls to yibam, the woman's an almanah by definition, right? I mean, she didn't have to previously do it. So the Gemara was going to discuss that. Or the next case is a halal shenasak sheira. The Gemara is going to point out over the next few days that part of our mission is to teach you a lot of these principles that you might have been confused about because of all the complicated Gemarot before. This is a little bit of a summary of all of this. So this Mishnah says a halal, which is a kohen, whose mother was prohibited, or he is somehow halal because he did something wrong, let's say, or he was born from a relationship that was not inappropriate. And he's a kohen halal who marries a kshira, which is totally permitted. We'll see a kohen halal can marry a woman who's not a kohenet, let's say. And yeshlo ach kasher, but he's got a brother who's a kohen who's sort of a complete kohen. And therefore the same problem. Once he marries this woman, a halal who marries a woman, she becomes a halala. If he then dies, that halala falls to his brother, who's a kohen kasher, who's not allowed to marry her, because a kohen cannot marry a halal. Or Yisrael shenasa bat Yisrael. Let's say a regular relationship, a regular Yisrael marries a bat Yisrael, but his brother is a mamzer, yishlach mamzer. So now when he dies, his wife or his widow cannot marry his brother who's a mamzer. Or a mamzer shenasa mamzeret, which we saw in the previous parak was okay, right? A mamzer marries a woman who's a mamzeret, but he has a brother who's not a mamzer, yishlo ach Yisrael, right? And of course, that's very possible because they come from different relationships, right? So they share a father, they don't necessarily share a mother, or they could even share a mother, but one situation, the father slept with her be'isur, and one he slept with her beheter, right? So one kid's a mamzer, one kid's not. In all those cases, those are mutarot lebalehem. These relationships are mutar to their spouses, but asurot liyab mehem, but they would not be allowed to marry the yavam. And in most cases, you would do chalitza or you would do nothing, right? And further, the following cases are the opposite, which are women who are mutar to their yavam, but they are also to their husband. How's that example? For example, kohen gadol shekidesh almana, but a kohen gadol who marries an almana. Now it's very pointed here that doesn't say that he slept with her. right? Because if a Kohen Gadol slept with an almanah, she would become a chalala, because she'd be having a relationship with someone she's prohibited to. And then she couldn't marry a Kohen. But if he just did kiddushin to her, then that's prohibited relationship. But she has not slept with him, and so she's not pasul. If he then dies, she falls to his brother, who's a Kohen Hedyot, who she can marry without any problem, right? So a Kohen Gadol, shekidesh et almanav, yishlo ach Kohen Hedyot. He's got a brother who's not a Kohen Gadol, right? And when he dies, the brother can marry his widow. Or a kasher shenasa chalala, regular Yisrael, a Kohen kasher, who marries a chalala, which again is prohibited, right? But he then dies, and yeshlo ach halal. He's got a brother who's a halal, who could marry a halala, so he can do yibam without any problem. Or Yisrael shenasa mamzeret, Yisrael marries a mamzeret, which is prohibited, but yeshlo ach mamzer. He's got a brother who's a mamzer, and so if he dies, his brother can do yibam. Or the opposite case, mamzer shenasa bat Yisrael, the man is a mamzer. He marries a bat Yisrael who's prohibited to him, but yeshlo ach Yisrael, but he's got a brother who's a regular not mamzer, regular Yisrael. So when the mamzer dies, his widow can marry his brother. All these cases, second wide line, mutarot liyamihem, basrot lebalihem. They're permitted to the yavam, but they're usher to the husband. And then there's the cases where you're usher to both. Elu asrot le'elu le'elu. Kohen Gadol shenasa et almanah. Let's say Kohen Gadol marries an almanah who he's not allowed to, and he has a brother who's also Kohen Gadol. Yishlach Kohen Gadol. I'm not exactly sure. You have two Kohanim Gadolim. Presumably, the brother becomes Kohen Gadol after he dies, but maybe it happens automatically, or maybe they had a backup. Anyways, his brother's also Kohen Gadol, or a Kohen Hedyot would also be a problem. Sorry, his brother's a Kohen Gadol or a Kohen Hedyot. The reason Kohen Hedyot would be a problem is because in this case we use the word nasa, which always means consummated the marriage. And if a Kohen Gadol actually consummates a marriage with an almanah, she becomes a chalala, right? So I think that would remain. She would become puzzled to even a Kohen Hedyot. The next case is a kasher, with third wide line, shenasa chalala, a Kohen who's kasher, who marries a chalala, which is prohibited. And yeshlo ach kasher, he's got a brother who's kasher who also can't marry her. So if the Kohen dies, his brother can't do yibam. Or Yisrael shenasa mamzer, the same equivalent case with Yisrael. Yisrael marries a woman who's a mamzer, and so he can't do that. Yeshlo ach Yisrael, sorry. He's got a brother who's also Yisrael, and his brother also is not allowed to sleep with this mamzer. Mamzer shenasa bat Yisrael, another case where they're both prohibited, both the original marriage between the brother, well, he's a brother, but between the husband and the wife, and the upcoming yibum, potential yibum, with the surviving brother and this widow, is a case of mamzer. Is that right? Yeah, mamzer shenasa bat Yisrael, right? A man who's a mamzer, marries a regular bat Yisrael, which is prohibited, of course. And he then dies. Yishlo ach mamzer. He's got a brother who's also a mamzer, comes from maybe from the same relationship, right? And so neither one is really allowed. Neither one's allowed to sleep with this woman who's a bat Yisrael. So in all these cases, asurot le'elu ve'elu. Chanan, we're 5 wide lines down. All these cases, the husband and the brother are prohibited to this woman, or she's prohibited to them. V'shar kol hanashim, but all other cases, mutarot lebalihem liyab mehem. The Gemara is going to, of course, ask. That's a very broad statement to me. But all other situations, the woman who's permitted to her husband is permitted to marry the Yavam. Now, what about some other cases? Continues the Mishnah. Shniot midivrei sofrim. Right? What about a case of shniot, a woman who's prohibited as an erva, but not min haTorah? So we talked about different shniot. The Rashi's example here is grandmother. So the Torah does not prohibit a person from sleeping with his grandmother. Okay? As foreign as that sounds, from his mother. Meaning you can't sleep, a person is prohibited from sleeping with his father's mother, but not his mother's mother. Now, the Chachamim said that's prohibited. So that is totally prohibited, midivrei sofrim, aim imo, mother's mother. Let's say someone has a shniot midivrei sofrim, who's a shniah, it's a second level isur relationship, libal, to the husband, right? Because let's say it's his mother's mother, but lo shniah liyavam, because he's got a brother who shares a father with, he doesn't share a mother with, right? So since he doesn't share a mother with her, his grandmother is not his brother's grandmother, and therefore his brother could sleep with his grandmother, right? So Ruvain's grandmother is not Shimon's grandmother. We're on Daf Pei Daled. Sorry. Daf Pei Daled at the long Mishnah, which we're almost done with. But anyways, in this case of Shniyot Midivrei Sofrim, if it's a Shniyah Lebal, the relationship is a prohibited second level, second generation, let's say, relationship to the husband, Velo Shniyah Liyavem, right? Then Asura Lebal Mutrat Liyavem. Then it would be prohibited to the husband if a man went and married his mother's mother and then he died. If the kedushin is tofes, because it's only midrabanan that it's not permitted, he obviously can now sleep with her. That would be very wrong, but it's only midivrei sofrim. And if he then dies, his brother, who does not necessarily share that same grandmother, would be chayiv to do yibum. Okay, mutaret liyavim. And the opposite could be true also. It could be a shniya liyavim, v'lo shniya lebal, where it's a generational prohibition to the Yavim, but not to the husband. Again, the case like this, through the mother, where they don't share a same mother, they only share a same father. Then in that case, Asura Yavim, she would be the Shni'ah, the relationship would be Asur to the Yavim, but Mutera to the Baal. And if it was Shni'ah Luzer, if a woman was a relationship midrabanan to both the husband and the Baal, then Asura Luzer should be prohibited to both. And period. So let's stop there. So that's our Mishnah. All these cases. Gemara is of course going to go through why we quote all these cases, but the Mishnah gives a very comprehensive list of cases where a woman can be prohibited to both her husband and the Yavim, or permitted to both, or prohibited to one and not to the other. Now, in all of these cases, and again, the Gemara is going to go through all this in great detail, but specifically in cases where a woman marries a man that's prohibited. So we're going to see that in some situations, we blame the woman, unfortunately, right? And we assume that, we'll see why. There's not every case, but she's complicit, let's say, in that act. And Ein La, in that case, she does not get lo ketubah. She doesn't have a right to collect the ketubah because basically she was involved in an illicit relationship. And lo perot, remember the halacha of perot is that if a woman comes into a marriage with property, nechsei melug, right? There are things that she owns. She leaves the marriage with them as well. But while she's married, her husband gets to eat the peirot, right? If she has a field, he gets all the apples, let's say. But in exchange, right, that's part of marriage. So in this case, he's got to, nichsei melug is where he's got to actually, she owns them and he's got to pay her back for the fruits that he takes from them. In this case, he does not have to, because since, again, it's a knas that we give her, and we'll discuss this all in the Gemara, because the marriage was inappropriate. And lo mizonot, he doesn't have to provide food for her, which, again, we'll discuss the specific details, but remember there's a takana in the ketubah that a husband has to provide provisions for his wife, even if he's leaving her, even if the marriage is breaking up until they're divorced. But in this case, he does not have to do that. And lo bilaot, he doesn't even have to give her the worn out clothing, which is, let's say she, brought clothing into the marriage and had, very nice things and they were worn out. She doesn't necessarily get to keep those because, again, it's a knas that the Rabbanan made, because in all these cases, it's a prohibited relationship. But havlad kasher, in all of them, a child who comes from that relationship is kasher. Again, we're going to have to see. Obviously, it does not refer to a mamzer, but we're going to see the cases. But these are presumably in the cases that are isur midrabanan. And kofin oto lahotzi, we force him to divorce her, to get rid of her, to leave the relationship. He's not allowed to stay married. The final case in the Mishnah, almana the kohen gadol. If you have a relationship that's prohibited min haTorah, these specific ones, like a widow who marries a kohen gadol, or grusha v'chalutza, the kohen hedyot, a divorcee, or a woman at chalitza who married a kohen hedyot, or a mamzeret netina Yisrael. Again, assuming a netin is not Jewish or is prohibited midoraita, a mamzeret netin Yisrael, or bat Yisrael netinu mamzer, a woman, bat Yisrael who marries a mamzer or netin. In all these cases, yesh lahem ketubah. They do have a ketubah. And so the Gemara is going to, of course, discuss, it seems a little strange that in the Isser Drabanan, there's no ketubah, but in the Isser Doraita, you retain a ketubah, and obviously there's going to be points that connect to that specific detail. But we'll get into all of this in the next few days. Now, says the Gemara, on Pei Daled Amud Aleph, 8 lines from the bottom. Why in the world did the Mishnah say, my area de Tani Nasa? Right, our Mishnah started off by saying a Kohen Hedyot, who married an almanah, And then he died, and his brother's a Kohen Gadol. Why Nasa again? Nasa as opposed to Kiddush. Kiddush means you did Kiddushin, which means that you got married but didn't consummate the marriage, or you're not living together yet. But it's an Eshet Ish for all purposes. Nisa implies that you actually slept with. Now, why did our Mishnah pointedly use the terminology of a Kohen Hedyot who married and slept with a Almanah? Why didn't it just say he did Kiddushin? The implication to our Gemara is that if he just did Kiddushin and then died, his brother, the Kohen Gadol, might do Yibam. Why would his brother, the Kohen Gadol, do Yibam? Remember, the Kohen Gadol has two separate prohibitions. One is that he's not allowed to marry an Almanah, which is a lo taseh. But there's another aseh that a Kohen Gadol has to marry a betula, a woman who's a virgin. Obviously, if the brother slept with her, she's not a betula anymore. So the implication of our Mishnah is that it's only because the brother slept with her, making her both not a betula and a almanah, that the Kohen Gadol cannot do yibum. But had she just been, quote unquote, an almanah, but not been a be'ula, she was still betula, maybe the Kohen Gadol could do yibum, because the aseh of yibum, vidocha the lo taseh of almanah not marrying a Kohen Gadol. Says the Gemara, my area de tani nasa. Why did you specifically say in our Mishnah that the Kohen Hedyot married her litni kidesh? Why didn't you just say kidesh, which would be, tell you less of a chidush, meaning, more of a chidush, sorry, that even if you only did kiddushin, and you might say what I just told you, the chitema taima did nasa. The Mishnah is pointed. You have to have married her, the havile aseh v'lo taseh, because then the Kohen Gadol sleeping with this woman would be violating both an aseh of not marrying a betula and a lo taseh of not marrying an almanah. Avo kidesh, but if the brother had just done kiddushin, maybe ati aseh of yibon, doche lo taseh of marrying an almanah. There's the Gemara, but our whole parak, hakula pirkin, aseh v'lo taseh. Our whole parak is referring to cases of aseh and lo taseh, and we never say, well, ati aseh v'doche lo taseh. Right? We have cases over and over, which we can go through in the rest of the Mishnah and throughout, where we don't say the aseh is doche lo taseh. So remember, we talked about this way back in the beginning of the Masechah, why we don't say that. But clearly we're taking for granted that the aseh of Yibam does not doche lo taseh of an erva. So clearly our Mishnah is not telling that. It must be it's mishum dekeboy the mitli sefer. Because in the end of our Mishnah, in the third grouping, we want to say a case of Kohen Gadol shenasa et almanah. Remember, the case was a Kohen Gadol married an almanah, and he has a brother who's a Kohen Hedyot, right? So he said that asur to both. Why is it asur to both? Because once the Kohen Gadol sleeps with the almanah, she becomes a chalala, because she's not allowed to sleep with the Kohen Gadol. And then she'd be prohibited even to a Kohen Hedyot. If she hadn't slept with the Kohen Gadol, she wouldn't be a chalala. And so there it was Dafka had to say nisa. So because it says Kohen Gadol, shnasa et almanah, Dafka nasa, shavya chalala, because it made her, through the act of bia, the act of intercourse, made her a chalala. Al kidesh, and she just done kiddushin to the Kohen Gadol, sharyalei, she would be permitted to a Kohen Hedyot. Therefore, since we had to say nasa in that case, because it was specifically slept with her, tananami reisha nasa. That's true. But there's another case in the middle. Adatani mishum seifa. Once you're saying the word nasa because of the end, listening mishum mitziata. What about the middle case? What was the middle case of our Mishnah? A Kohen Gadol shekidesh et almanah. He only did kiddushin, right? He only did kiddushin. Remember, the case was yesh lo ach Kohen Hedyot, and that was a case where she's prohibited to Kohen Gadol, she can't marry a Kohen almanah, but permitted to the Kohen Hedyot, who's allowed to marry an almanah. Doesn't work. You're right. It doesn't make any sense. That's not why we say the word nasa. Ela mishum bat bukta. It's because of its neighbor. I'm not sure the exact derivation of this word. The bat bukta, as Rashi explains here, means the one next to it, the case right after the Kohen Gadol. What's the case right next to it? The Kabbalah the Mitni, because the next case that we say in the Mishnah is Chalal Shenasak Shira. You have a Kohen who's a Chalal who sleeps with a woman who's kosher. Now that specifically is only because he slept with her. Again, because by sleeping with her, she becomes a Chalala. If he only did Kiddushin, she wouldn't become a Chalala. So the Taima de Nasa. There it specifically is because he slept with her, the Shavya Chalala, of a Kiddush, but had he just done Kiddushin, Shayla, she would be permitted, Mishum Hachi Katani Nasa. Therefore, we say the word Nasa in the beginning of a Mishnah. Well, the reason our Mishnah starts with the word of Kohen Gadol Halal Shenasak Shira is because the next case is, Kohen Hedyot Shenasat Almanah is because the next case is halal shenasak sheva. Now the Gemara asked the question I mentioned in the Mishnah. My area de katani almana litni bitula. Why does our Mishnah say on the page? Well, why does our Mishnah say a kohen who married an almana and then died, and then his brother, the kohen gadol, cannot marry her? Even he had married a non-almana, right? It wouldn't have mattered because when he dies, she always becomes an almana, right? Yibum only happens in the setting of death. There's no other context. So it might be, and these are all concepts that are familiar to all of us, I'm sure. The chitema could be kasavar haitana. Maybe the Tana of our Mishnah holds nisuin harishonin mapilim, that the first marriage is what initiates the process of yibum. Remember the way I articulated this before, which is not perfectly accurate, is that when a Reuven marries a woman and he has a brother named Shimon, it could be that Shimon's connection to this wife does not happen when Reuven dies and she then falls to Shimon. It happens when Reuven marries her, that basically Reuven is marrying her plus all of Reuven's relatives are married. And so that, again, not quite literally.
And Zika, they're not marrying her, but they're
correct. But there's something in that Nisuin Harishonim, in the first marriage, is Mapil, is what actually connects her to Yibum. And that at that time, remember, so when Reuven, let's say Reuven's a Kohen Hadyot, right? If Reuven marries a woman who's not an almanah, then she basically develops a relationship, a zika, as Hanan put it, to Shimon, who's a Kohen Gadol, at that time. Now she's not married. She's not a widow, sorry. She's married. She's not a widow. And so maybe then when Reuven dies and she falls to Shimon, Shimon can sleep with her and marry her. Because even though Shimon's a Kohen Gadol and she's a widow, the time that the connection started at that, basically when Reuven married her, she was not a widow yet.
Yeah.
Right, which would be a fascinating halacha. Meaning it's basically saying that Yibum started at the time the initial marriage started.
Well,
right?
Yeah.
Because for example, let's say a Kohen Gadol. Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a woman who's not a Betula. But obviously if he marries a woman who's a Betula and he sleeps with her, she's not a Betula anymore, right? So he can stay married to her because at the time of the marriage it was okay. So maybe you say something similar here, which would be fascinating. How about the next case? The case of a halal shenasak shira. Remember, we talked about a man who's a halal, who marries a woman who's kosher. We then said she doesn't fall to his brother who's a kohen because she becomes a halala, right, by sleeping with him. But at the time they got married, they hadn't slept together yet. She's not a halala yet. And so if she falls to Yibam at that moment, she falls to Yibam as a kshira, right? So what about harich halal, second line, shenasak kshira? We don't say, lo amina, no one has the thought, our mission doesn't say, nisuin harishonim mapilim, right? No one goes that far to say that because at the time she married the first brother, she was not halala, she slept with him and became a halala, but she doesn't become pasul. So Ella, that can't be the case. Navadai mishum seifa. The reason we say almana is because of the last case in the Mishnah. The seifa, the flip case, basically, we say Kohen Gadol shenasat almana, right? A Kohen Gadol marries a widow, which is prohibited. V'yeshno ach Kohen Gadol o Kohen Hadyot. He's got a brother who's a Kohen Gadol or a brother's a Kohen Hadyot. Now, why is the Kohen Hadyot prohibited to marry a widow? There's no prohibition. It's because his brother, the Kohen Gadol, slept with a widow and made her a halala. But if she wasn't a widow, if the Kohen Gadol had married a woman who's not a widow, she would be permitted to the brother, the Kohen Hadyot, right, when he dies. So, dafka almana of a betula chazile. A betula would be permitted to marry the brother who's a Kohen Hadyot, who's not a Kohen Gadol. That's why we said almana. Okay, so that's the explanation for the words in our Mishnah, though they don't make any sense. They're said because we want to keep symmetry in the Mishnah so everyone can remember. Now, Matkif Rav Papa, this has nothing to do with the previous statement. Rav Papa asked a question. He said, look, I've been holding on to this question for many days here. I've been wondering. Remember last week, I'm sure he learned Daf Yomi, right? So last week, we had a whole discussion about what happens in the Mitzri relationship. Right? So remember that the Torah says that in Mitzri Shlishi, Dar Shlishi is permitted. We had a big debate a week ago, last Monday, I think, about whether a Mitzri child is a second generation Mitzri, whether it goes after the father or goes after the mother, right? Remember, a Mitzri is allowed to marry a Mitzri. So let's say you have a first generation Mitzri who marries a first generation Mitzri, their child is second generation Mitzri. That's obvious. But what if you have a first generation Mitzri who marries a second generation Mitzriya, Mitzri, right? Do you go after the father or go after the mother? Or do you go after the more chamor? Do you go? So we discussed all this last week, right? Now, says Rav Papa, I've been laying awake at night thinking about this since I heard what Rav Dimi Amar Yochanan said. Because remember what Rav Dimi Amar Yochanan said. Says the Gemara, Matkev the Rav Papa. If it was true, if what Rav Dimi Amar Yochanan was said, what did he say? What was he quoted? That Mitzri Sheni Shnasam Mitzrit Rishona. That if you have a guy, a man, who's a second generation Mitzri, who marries a woman who's a first generation Mitzri, she converted, right? So then, Bina Sheni, you go after the mother. The kid becomes a Sheni, right? Not a Shlishi, not like the father. Father's son should be a Shlishi, but since the mother was a Rishon, the kid becomes a Sheni and is prohibited. If that's true, then our Mishnah should have said something about this. Why in the world didn't we have a case in our Mishnah of a person who's prohibited to the husband and permitted to the brother, et cetera, et cetera? What's the case? Havi Litni, our Mishnah should have said, Litni Nami, Mitzri Sheni, this following case, where you have a guy who's a second generation Mitzri, Shenasa Shtei Mitzriot. He marries two women, they're both converts from Egyptian converts, right? That's, I guess, culturally, that's fitting together. But one of them is a first generation and one of them is a second generation. And of course, he's got children from both, right? Remember, this man is the father. So all the children fall to each other to even. They're all brothers, but they have different mothers, right? So some of these children are, according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that you go after the mother, some children are second generation Mitzri and prohibited to marry a Yisrael, right? Lavo B'Kahal. And some children are third generation Mitzri and permitted completely to marry B'Kahal, right? And they're all brothers, right? So there's four brothers, let's say, two are permitted and two are prohibited.
So it doesn't affect their, the fact that they can't marry a Jew, regular Jew, whatever, doesn't affect their requirement to do Yibum.
No, Mike, that's their case. So this is a beautiful case. Let's say you have, let's just say two brothers, right? The father had two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven's mother is a Mitzri Rishona, so he's a Mitzri Sheni. He can't marry B'Kahal. Shimon's mother is a Mitzri Shnia, so he's a Mitzri Shlishi. He can marry anybody he wants. He's open in the market, right? So now you have two brothers. One is prohibited to marry B'Kahal, one is permitted. So you can think of all these great cases now. If one brother marries a woman who's not allowed to, and he dies, the other brother's allowed to marry that woman. So it's asur to this one and mutar to the other, or the opposite, right? So why don't we use this case in our Mishnah? Our Mishnah has all these cases where a Kohen Hedyot, a Kohen Gadol. This is a great case. You can have two brothers, but usually it's hard to have two brothers who have different religious experiences, right? Because if they come from the same status, they have the same status. Our Mishnah, for example, gave the case of a mamzer and a not mamzer, which can happen with two brothers, right? Because they have the same father, and one slept with someone, the father slept with someone appropriate or someone inappropriate.
They're half brothers.
Well, they're half brothers, right? But as long as you have the same father, that's what Yibum is, correct? But if Mitzri follows the mother, then our Mishnah should have these beautiful.
They can be full brothers, no?
With mamzer, they can be full brothers, right? Yeah. I'm sorry, because the father could have slept with a woman who was permitted to him, like he could have married her, and then she was an Eshet Ish, and he slept with her again. Let's say, right? It could be the same woman, correct? For mamzer, but for Mitzri, you now have this great case, right? So why don't you say? Well, let's read it inside. He's got two children. He marries two women who are converts from Egyptian converts. One is first generation, one is second generation. He then has children from the first wife and the first generation woman and the second generation. And obviously, if they marry regularly, meaning they marry the people they're supposed to, then, meaning the Mitzri Sheni marries a woman who's a Mitzrit, and the Mitzri Shlishi marries a kosher woman, then Mutarat L'Balehem, Masurat L'Yamehem. Then they would both be permitted to marry their husbands, because a Mitzri can marry a Mitzri, but a Yisrael cannot marry a Mitzri. And a Yisrael can marry Yisrael, but cannot marry a Mitzri. Right? V'yepach v'nasuv, and if they married the wrong people, meaning a Mitzri married the Yisrael, and the Yisrael married the Mitzri, then Mutarat L'Yamehem, Masurat L'Yamehem. Then they would be permitted to their yavams, but usher to their husbands. And mutarot le'elu would be a gioret, right? If they were exactly what the case is, right? But a gior means a kahal. A gior is allowed to marry a mitzrit because kahal gerim is loikri kahal according to this opinion. So a woman who converted can marry a mitzrit convert, basically. And asirot le'ilele would be islanded, which really doesn't have anything to do with anything. But we're just throwing it in there, right? A woman who couldn't marry either is an island, because an island is not supposed to marry a man because that's a regular prohibition. It has nothing to do with mitzri. But anyways, we're throwing in a little bit of an extra case there. So why didn't we, according to this opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, that mitzri follows the mother, the Mishnah should have had a case of mitzri. Again, the opposite of that is, sorry, one second. The opposite of that is according to the other opinion where you follow the father. Because if you follow the father, then of course the brothers can never be different statuses, right? Even if a father who's a mitzri sheni, let's say, married a one woman who's a mitzri rishon or a mitzri sheni, the kids follow the father. So either they're going to be kosher or not kosher, right? The kids will never have different statuses. But anyways, okay. So that's the question.
If they have the same mother and two different fathers,
then they're not brothers. Forgive me.
I see.
Says the Gemara. Well, the answer is Tana v'shir. You know what? The Tana just was not comprehensive. The Tana said some cases and left out other cases. Tana v'shir, right? So the Tana gave a list, but didn't put everything in the list. Says the Gemara. No, that's not something you can say very easily about a Mishnah, right? Because when a Mishnah gives a list, we always assume the Tana is teaching you everything, unless it's not a comprehensive list. So you have to find something else that was left out to justify leaving this one out, right? So we call it my shiur, the high shiur. What else was left out that this was left out? Meaning, if you can show me that the Tana was not being comprehensive, they were being illustrative, they were just giving examples, then sure, you can leave out other examples. But if there's no other exceptions, that's a problem. It says, well, shiur pitzua daka. The Tana left out pitzua daka. Remember this we discussed last parak as well. The Kohen, not a Kohen, sorry, a woman is not allowed to marry a pitzua daka. Of course, you can have two brothers who are very well related and have the same father and the same mother, and they're kosher, but one's a pitzua daka and one's not, right? In which case, a woman would be permitted to the regular one, the one who's intact, and not to the one who's a pitzua daka. So it's a very easy case where you can have two brothers who have different statuses. Right, one fell off the horse and had crushed testicles. So it's pretty straightforward. Says well, that's not a proof at all. That doesn't count as an exception. The Tana said that you're not allowed. You talked about cases of chayve lavin, like a nitin, let's say, or a mamzeret, or a halal. These are all chayve lavin. The Torah didn't need to list every law. Everyone knows that a pitzua daka is a lotase, so it didn't have to list it. This is where, well, you can't answer that. There's atu chayve lavin, milo katani, v'hadar tani. Our Mishnah told many cases where you had a chayve lavin, and then we said a second case. So if we were including everything, we would include pitzua daka. The fact that we didn't include pitzua daka implies that we're leaving some things out, and so we might be leaving out the case of the mitzri. What's the case? Al-Katani, because we learned in our Mishnah, Kohen Hadyot Shenasa Almana, right, which is a lotase. Kohen Hadyot is not allowed, a Kohen Hadyot is allowed to marry an Almana, but his brother, the Kohen Gadol, is not allowed to, right? So the lotase is the Kohen Gadol. And then we said Chalal Shenasa Kshera, a Chalal who marries a Kshera, which is of course permitted, but the brother the Chalal is the brother who marries a kshera, his brother, who's a kosher kohen, is not allowed to sleep with the woman because she's now a chalala. Says well, we needed to tell you those two cases. Who is strichalev? That's telling you the chiddush of Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. What does Rabbi Yehuda Amarav tell you? The lohus haruk kshirot v'hinasei l'psulim. Right? We learned, which is a halacha that nobody sort of questioned yet, which is that a man, a kohen, is not allowed to marry a chalala. But as we seem to imply in our Mishnah, is there's no problem with a halal marrying a kohenet, right? She's a kohenet. Her husband is pasul. But it seems, as says Rabbi Yehuda Amarav, that's not a problem. Sherot, women, kohanot, I guess, who are kosher, are allowed to marry psulim. They're allowed to marry a halal. The prohibition of a halal and a kohen only goes one direction. It only goes if the husband is a halal. It only goes if the woman is a halala the husband cannot marry her. Kohen cannot marry a halala. But a woman who's a kosher kohenet is allowed to marry a halal and sleep with a halal, right? She becomes a halala, just to be clear, but there's no prohibition in that. It's not a lotas. So that's the chiddush of our Mishnah. It says, well, what about the next case? Katani, it says, halal shenasak shira, right? A halal who marries a kosher woman, which again, she becomes then a halala when she sleeps with him, and a Yisrael shenasa bat Yisrael, a regular Yisrael who marries a regular bat Yisrael, so there's nothing wrong with that relationship. Unfortunately, though, yeshlo ach mamzer, his brother happens to be a mamzer, so when he dies and his wife, his widow, falls to his brother, that's a prohibited relationship because the brother's a mamzer. Says the Gemara, well, hanami lo mahadr mitznahi, that doesn't count as a repeat case. Tashmi'ina lav she'in shava b'kol. It's telling you both by a lav that does not apply to everybody, like a kohen and a chalala, only applies to kohanim. Tashmi'ina lav, kamashmila lav hashaveh b'kol. We're also telling you about a lotaseh that applies to everyone, like mamzer, that applies to all people. Says well, there's another case in our Mishnah. Katani Yisrael shenasa mamzeret. Right? The Torah said the pasuk. Sorry, the Mishnah said the case of the Yisrael who married a woman who was a mamzeret, and yeshlo ach Yisrael. So basically, that's a repetitive case as well. El alav, skip the tudat, skip the parentheses. El alav shmamina, tanav v'shir shmamina. See that our Mishnah basically just left out cases, right? Our Mishnah did not say all the cases. The case that it left out was a petzua daka, right? So if one of the brothers, again, it could be either the husband or the yavim, is a petzua daka because they got injured and they are no longer allowed to marry bikahal. So then a woman who fell to yibum would be puzzled to one and permitted to the other. And the fact that our Mishnah left that out implies that our Mishnah might have left out other cases, including specifically Rabbi Yochanan's case of the Mitzri, who even though it goes after the mother, and so you can have Mitzri brothers who are, one are permitted and one is prohibited, those are left out of the Mishnah. It's not a proof one way or the other.
So it's not a complete list, or it might be.
Not correct. It's not a complete list.
It's almost impossible to have a complete list. I mean,
That's true.
How could you think of every single case? I mean,
it's true, but what you could have done, so what our Gemara is actually pointing out is you could have said one of each, right? You could have said one lotaseh, one lotaseh shebichlal, one, and then you would have, if you had not said two, then we would have said it's essentially, all the iterations in our Mishnah would have been included there.
it's if you say one, then that it's like a prototype or something.
Well,
And
had you only said, remember, a mitzvah might only be an isser, right? It would have been a prototype.
okay.
Okay, continues the Gemara now at the two dots. Gufa. Let's just go back to this final statement that we just made. I know this is a confusing Gemara, but I'm sure everyone's following. Says Rav Yehuda Amarav, Lo huzharu kesherot linaseh lepsulim. There's no prohibition on a woman who's a kohenet, who's kosher, who comes from the best family, the most miyuchas family of kohanim, to marry a man who is not a kohen, okay, who is prohibited. Well, he's a halal, right? So not a kohen, he's a kohen pasul. So there's no prohibition of a kesherot linaseh lepsulim. How do we lema misayin? Let's try to prove that from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said a halal shenasak kshera. A halal in our Mishnah married a kshera, right? And we said then, and right, he has a brother, so he's mutar to the husband. She's mutar to the husband, but usher to the brother, right? So you see, she's mutar to the husband. Now, is she a kohenet or not? My love, it must be kohenet. But she's a kohenet haru'uyala because she's, what the kohen would usually, presumably, marry a kohenet. So this halal married a kosher, who's presumably a kohenet, and my kshera the kuhuna, that she is kosher to marry the kuhuna, right? It's where low. It's referring to a Yisraeli. It's referring to a Yisraeli. My kshera likahal. We're saying that she's a kosher, not that she's a kosher likuhuna. She's kosher likahal. She can marry anybody. So nichlal to who pasul likahal. But then that would imply she's kosher. He's pasul. She can marry anybody, but he can't necessarily. Who pasul likahal. Elalav, it must be referring to a kohen. That the man is a kohen. Umidahu kohen, he kohenet. If the man is a kohen, presumably the corresponding woman he's marrying is kohenet. That's not a proof. Meet the area, hakitisa. It could be that each one is separate. So it's not a proof from this case that just because the man is a Kohen, the woman is a Kohenet, and that since she's allowed to marry him, that a woman who's a Kohenet is allowed to marry a Chalal. Again, that's how we pass it. But you can't prove that from the Mishnah, because it could be that it's only referring to a case where a woman who's a Yisraelit marries a Kohen who's a Chalal. And that maybe, in theory, maybe a Kohenet, a female Kohen, would not be allowed to marry a Chalal, just like a Kohen cannot marry a Chalala, right? So we don't have a proof from our Mishnah.
What does Kohenet mean again?
The daughter of a Kohen.
Daughter of a Kohen. But
You might think that a Kohenet has Kedusha, that, and she does, that she can eat Truma, etc., that she cannot marry a Chalal.
Right.
But that's wrong. But we're trying to prove that that's the case, right? So, but it could be that our Mishnah is not referring to a Kohenet. Or Mishnah is saying a Chalal, Kohen Chalal, marries a Bat Yisrael.
Right, but a Kohen doesn't have to marry a Bat Kohen. I mean,
He doesn't. But again, that's the answer of the Gemara. But the assumption we're making was that usually people stick together. Mitzvah marries.
I see.
Mativ Rav and Bar Nachman. As said Rav and Bar Nachman, what about the following bright? This is a quote from a bright. It says lo yikhu, right? It says twice in the pasuk, don't take, right? That they shouldn't get married. It's referring to marrying a chalal. Melamed shehaisha muzheret ayidei haish. This tells you, right, that a woman is prohibited from marrying a man in an inappropriate relationship, right? So what's that referring to? It seems to imply that a woman can't marry a man who couldn't marry her, meaning that it goes both ways. Amar Rava, no. Here's how it works. Kol heichadu hu mushar, he mushar, right? Wherever the man is mushar, is not allowed to sleep with her, she is also mushar, meaning a halal is not allowed to marry a kshera, right? It means that a kshera cannot marry a halal, right? Just to be clear. It's not that a kshera, so because it's an illicit relationship, they're both party to that relationship. So it's not that a bat kohen can't marry a halal. Bat kohen can marry a halal, right? But what can happen is a halal is not allowed, or any relationship. Let's say, let me give you a different example. A kohen is not allowed to marry a grusha, right? Kohen, kosher, is not allowed to marry a woman who's divorced, right? It means that the divorcee also cannot marry the kohen, right? It goes both directions. So she's over the lotas the same way he's over the lotas of doing that, right? Not the opposite. Not that a woman who's a kohenet can't marry a man who was divorced. Obviously, it's not how we paskin, right? So it means that she cannot participate in the same relationship that he cannot participate in. So I'll read those words in Rav. If he can't, let's say he's a divorced person, can't marry a kohenet, he muzharet. So she would be muzharet. If he's not muzhar, she's also not muzhar. And that was what we learn out from the pasuk of excuse me, lo yikhu 2 times. That basically the relationships all go in 2 directions. Or for example, take the case of a mamzer, right? A mamzer is not allowed to marry bikahal, which means the opposite too, that a woman bikahal cannot marry a mamzer. It goes both directions. This is more, what in the world? We know that. Everybody knows that. 6 lines on the bottom.
What is the nafkamina of that? What
means we punish her.
That she doesn't get her ketubah?
Maybe, but it also means it's a lotas. She might get malkud. She might get karet, depending on what the prohibition is.
I see.
Doesn't matter. Did you learn that from here? Everyone knows it. It sounds so weird to us because we assume this. Obviously, it's a given, right? We've talked about this many times. It says ish o isha ki yaseh mikoch chatota adam, right? And that's a weird pasuk. Why say a man or a woman? Of course, it's a man or a woman. Why you think karbanot only apply to one gender? It says the Gemara many times. You see on the left in Maseret Shas, this is quoted 10 times in the Gemara. That for all punishments, with some minor exceptions, but for almost all punishments in the Torah, men and women are the same. There's no gender differences. Eating chametz on Pesach or sleeping with the mamzer, or none of these things matter. Well, that should tell you that every prohibition applies, regardless of the man or the woman. It says, well, that's not clear. If it was from just that pasuk of Ish o Isha, Hava Mina Lav Hashaveh B'Kol, I would have thought that only applies the prohibitions that apply to all Bnei Yisrael. like eating chametz on Pesach, or not sleeping with the mamzer, or what, things that are universal among Bnei Yisrael. Lav she'eino shaveh b'kol, like the things that apply to Kohen, right? Like halal, I would have thought low. And so I would not have known that it applies by lav she'eino shaveh b'kol, right? It says the Gemara, well, what about Tum'ah, top of Pehem and Aleph? What about the case of Tum'ah, right? Which the lav she'ein shaveh b'kol, that's not a lav that applies to all people. Remember, a Kohen is not allowed to become tamei to a mate. But a Yisrael is allowed to become tamei to a mate. There's no prohibition, right? You can't go into the Beit HaMikdash, but there's no prohibition on a Yisrael becoming tamei. That's a lav she'ein shaveh b'kol. And we learned elsewhere, time in the Katav Rachmana b'nei Aharon, right? Dabrel b'nei Aharon, below benot Aharon, right? Remember, we discussed this, I think, recently, right? We talked about the halacha that a Kohen is not allowed to become tamei to a mate. That only applies to male Kohanim, not to female Kohanot, right? And we learned that from a pasuk. Time of the Katav Rachmana, the Torah specifically says, Dabrel b'nei Aharon, speak to the sons of Aaron, telling you lo benot Aharon. Now, let's say the Torah had not said that. The Torah just said, Kohanim don't become tamei. You would have thought, halav hachi, third line, havamina nashim chayavot. You would have assumed women are chayav for becoming tamei. Now, why are women chayav from becoming tamei? Can't say it's because men and women are equal for everything, because this is a lav she'ein shaveh b'kol. This is a lo taseh that only applies to Kohanim. It doesn't apply to Yisrael to become tamei. So, my taima, lav misham, the Rav Yehuda Marav. You must assume that it applies from Rav Yehuda Marav. Says more lo. The Gamrina me lo yikchu. It must be that we learned that out from lo yikchu. So basically, this is why we have two things in the Torah. One tells you ish o isha, to tell you that when there's a lo taseh that applies to all of Bnei Yisrael, right? It also applies to men and women. There's no exceptions, unless the Torah makes an exception, but almost no exceptions. Second of all, for things that apply only to Kohanim, you have this new pasuk of a lo yikchu, telling me both ways. Man, don't take them and don't take them, meaning a Kohen who's a Kohen is not allowed to sleep with a Chalala, right? But the same is also true that a Chalala is not allowed to sleep with a Kohen, or a Grusha is not allowed to sleep with a Kohen. And so from lo yikchu, we learned that not only can the man not take the woman can't take the man, meaning she's, again, assuming that she has an agency in that, it would be a prohibition for her as well to engage in this act. But what it doesn't tell you, right? What it doesn't tell you is that she is prohibited in the equivalent case. And let's just do the last line because it's the end of the sugya. Ika da Amri, there's some who say that kicha, it's trichale, that in fact, we do need kicha, to tell you lo yikchu, that the prohibition applies both ways. Because I would have actually thought that you learned from Tumah kamash balan. But since by Tumah, the Torah very explicitly tells you, right, that it only applies, Daber al Bnei Yisrael, that it only applies to the male Kohanim, not to the female Kohanim. You would have thought that other prohibitions of Kuna, like marrying a divorcee, only apply to the man, not to the woman. Mashmalam, that it applies both ways. And that's what lo yikchu tells you. So just to be clear, though, it doesn't apply both ways, meaning a man who's divorced, right, whatever you call that, is not prohibited from marrying a woman who's a bat kohen. It's not that it goes both ways. Only a kohen is prohibited from marrying a grusha, but only a kohen is prohibited from marrying a chalala, right? But a kohenet is allowed to marry a chalal, and that's our case of our mission. So the prohibitions only apply in those cases to male kohanim, or what is said in the Torah. Stop there, everyone.
Bat Kohen cannot marry a halal. That's what you're saying.
Bat Kohen can marry a halal. That's the
Can.
word. Can, yes. C-A-N. And that's we learned it out from these psukim. Okay.
The Yisrael can marry a halal too, right?
Yisrael absolutely can marry a halal.
Bat Kohen can marry a divorcee, a
Correct.
convert.
All of this is correct. The only prohibition is on the man in these cases.
Right. Right.
But we learn it from the psukim, because you would have thought that
We just proved that.
That's what we just proved. Correct.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Happy Memorial Day.
Thank you.
Memorial Day.
Enjoy.
Okay. Take care.